Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this Space Week New York Spotlight conversation with Michael Castle-Miller with the Lunar Development Co-operative. This is a really interesting conversation. We're glad to bring this to you as part of our Space Week program, where we highlight interesting companies and organizations across New York that are really on the cutting edge of some of these conversations about what the 21st century space age is going to look like and the role that New York is going to play in that. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Castle-Miller to introduce himself and tell us all how we got here today.
Thanks, Patrick. It's great to be part of this event. So I am coming from outside the space industry, actually. I have been a lawyer and policy advisor who develops new jurisdictions, areas with different laws than the rest of the country around them. And I've done this in about 35 countries, and they sometimes go by the name of special economic zones, sometimes free ports, charter cities, if you've heard of those, and various other kinds of structures like this. And what I essentially do is draft laws, set up public-private partnership frameworks, stand up new regulatory agencies, both for governments and private investors developing those zones. And it's a fascinating opportunity to be laying down better systems or better rules than are otherwise in place. And one of the things I've always helped countries do is just sort of see these places as pilot areas for reforms that are needed in the country. So areas for experimenting or rolling out new changes that to a given policy area, and covering normally in kind of economic or investment space, but it really could cover just about any policy area. But about 5 years ago, I met with somebody named Hoyt Davidson and a number of other space experts on translating that work into a framework that would support the development of the economic development of the moon. And we got input from a wide range of people and learned, adapted lessons from history, from various structures that have been used in the past, both good and bad, from eras of colonization and development of maritime law and commercial law and other things, and figured out sort of what went wrong with some of those from an economic and social perspective, and what types of projects produce good outcomes, and ended up arriving at something called the Lunar Development Co-operative, which I'm now leading an effort to create.
Well, thank you very much for that background. It's a very interesting area of study, and I think it leads us into this conversation of challenges in creating a sustainable space economy. It's not the first time that topic has come up this week. So based on your experience developing these special jurisdictions, what are the major challenges we face in creating a sustainable space economy?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So one of the features, the design kind of parameters, I guess, for designing a framework like this is that under the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, nations cannot claim territory and appropriate territory, and so can't just sort of extend their boundaries into space and start applying their laws there. So that leaves us with it cuts off the kind of the main way in which we govern areas, which is there is a nation that is sovereign over an area and can apply their laws there. So we've got to come up with another framework, and the kind of default that most people have looked at is an international regime where you have multilateral treaties agreed to by nations that create enforceable laws. The problem is international law is very inadequate to creating the type of framework that we need for an economy to flourish. It might be different in a place like Antarctica, but if we're actually looking at economic interactions and using space resources, which I believe we should, creating a regulatory framework for that is not something that really can be done through treaties, because treaties typically result in very high level principles and are typically not enforceable legally, or very limited means of enforcement. So how do you create rules that other people are going to be bound to, that they follow? So that's one challenge. And we have to fill that challenge, because the other challenge is that if we don't, space becomes space resources become open access resources, which are vulnerable to a tragedy of the commons situation, where people begin kind of plundering and trying to extract as much as they can without regard to overall efficient use of the resource, and lots of conflicts and waste and harms can be done. Another result of this that could be is that essentially you have a resurgence of the company state model. Company states were large corporations that effectively governed areas of the world after being given monopolies over trade. So you might be familiar with company states like the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company and the Royal African Company. And in the Americas, there was the Dutch West India Company, which is actually were in the area that I live in New York. These resulted in, had a really destructive impact economically, socially, and environmentally on areas. And that's primarily because they were single companies that were given the power to adopt and enforce laws and impose taxes and wage war. And their financial incentives were entirely driven to maximize profit for their shareholders. And they were very top-down, kind of essentially what we call central planned entities that were driven to maximize their own profit, because you have a board of directors sitting in Whitehall Street in London, effectively governing all of India. And so they would make poor decisions also, and only invest in things that maximize their own company without looking at creating a prosperous economy benefiting everyone. And so they caused a famine that killed approximately a third of the population in India. And the Dutch East India Company brutally suppressed any attempts to for local people to assert their own sovereignty or to compete with the East India Company's business. So they did not foster a diverse, competitive, open, free market economy at all. It was the exact opposite. And so I think because of the enormous costs of getting to space and the difficulty that governments will have in mobilizing the political resources to fund space development, we could see a resurgence of that older model to fill in the gap. Finally, sorry, I'm giving a long-winded answer, but another major challenge is the financing of space infrastructure. And what I mean by this is the fundamental infrastructure that supports overall growth. We have funding for projects on Earth like roads and power and seaports and airports and the internet and all these things that we rely on that just produce benefits that distribute benefits over an entire society without because of the legal reality of space, we don't have a natural answer to who will pay for all of that stuff. So anyway, I'll stop there. I've talked long enough.
No, I think it's helpful to illuminate. I think most people who are in any form of the space industry would probably relate to at least one of those challenges when thinking about, how we go to the moon and go there to, stay. Apollo wasn't really faced with any of those challenges because you're going for such a short period of time. But to actually go in a permanent capacity, all of those challenges make sense. But we're not here to dig into the challenges. We're here to talk about solutions, which is what you're here to discuss, which is the Lunar Development Co-operative. So tell us about the Lunar Development Co-operative and how it addresses these, significant challenges.
Yeah. And so here's the approach we're taking to this is rather than waiting on, the nations to get together and diplomatically form a treaty, we can instead build on the work that treaties have done and will continue to do by creating an entity that has the ability and the incentive to be translating the principles that the international community develops for space into real, practical, implementable, binding norms and standards, and ultimately a legal framework for space. And we do this by creating the Lunar Development Co-operative, which will be an infrastructure and public service provider for anyone operating on the moon who agrees to become a member. Becoming a member means forming a contract with the LDC that includes certain rules. And those rules will serve as the foundation for a sustainable economy, society, and environment in space. And this is not just a model for the moon. It can be used for asteroids, for Mars, and other locations throughout the solar system. You could think of it a little bit like a club that builds a seaport for its members. And anyone can become a member as long as they follow the club's rules. And actually, the LDC will be structured not too differently from how some seaports or other large infrastructure projects are today. Rather than creating a typical space agency, this would be a commercial entity that has up to 49% of its shares bought by as many nations as possible, and 51% or more by as many companies and individuals as possible. The developing nations and indigenous groups will have special access to LDC shares so they can purchase them at discounted rates in the future. And we'll make the private sector shares available on a universally accessible platform at a low minimum investment limit that allows almost everyone on Earth to become a shareholder. We want to make the LDC humanity's holding company for the moon. And we also want to make the LDC a public benefit company that has its financial interests aligned with the long-term interests of the lunar economy, society, and environment. And we'll do that by putting limits on the amount of control that any one investor can have, like maybe a 10% cap on total ownership. We'll make membership entirely voluntary, so members can leave if they aren't happy. We will prevent the LDC from engaging in private goods markets, like they can't sell lunar mined resources, for instance. That prevents it from setting up a monopoly in other industries and using its leverage over infrastructure in order to force people to only buy and sell with their own companies. And it will be subject to robust accountability through a legal framework that includes an inspector general's office, contracts with members that allow people to sue the LDC, a founding charter that effectively serves as the LDC's constitution. So we're both trying to meet the gap in infrastructure, in being able to finance infrastructure that benefits everybody by creating an entity that will be able to internalize the benefits distributed across the entire economy, which I can talk about later. But and by and filling in the gaps in the legal framework for space by making use of the infrastructure dependent on people forming a legally binding enforceable contract that obligates them to rules of conduct in space.
So that's very, very interesting. A kind of elegant solution to a lot of those different challenges that you had illuminated in the beginning. So when you talk about infrastructure, I guess just details about what exactly like the LDC would kind of build and maintain when you talk about that core infrastructure? Just kind of detail that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I like to look at this in sort of three categories. There are Earth-based services, cislunar, which is the space between the Earth and the Moon, and lunar surface. Lunar surface, would primarily be clustering our services at just one or a few locations and creating service hubs. And so at a service hub, you might have a landing pad, power, roads, other surface transportation, emergency shelters and backup supplies, closed loop biological waste recycling for keeping ecological balance among members' habitats. Ultimately looking at systems like a mass driver for getting material off the surface, or a lunar space elevator. And also an LDC site use registry that begins to provide standards around non-interference. So these are types of things we build on the surface. In cislunar space, this could include communications, PNT, position, navigation, and timing, lunar internet. So we could integrate or be kind of like a main body for coordinating the development of LunaNet, which the ESA is working on right now. Beaming power down to the surface from lunar orbit down to spots on the surface. Eventually a port for shipments to and from the moon, like an L1, we could manage, develop and manage profitably. And then lunar surface services, things like some physical facilities, providing information on lunar surface to members, and other things that we'd be developing. And the important thing to point out here is that the LDC is a organization composed of members, and so it would not be developing, it wouldn't be competing with any particular space company that is already working on these infrastructure solutions. In fact, the LDC would be funding them, because it would be contracting companies in order to deliver the power and communications and roads and landing pad and so forth on the surface. So for a space company, it provides a really great opportunity, one, to have another customer that is not just NASA or a government agency, because the LDC would be a multinational funder of lunar infrastructure that would contract companies or invest in them in order to build this infrastructure. But it also becomes the creator of a town. You can imagine that joining the LDC is like the difference between going off into the wilderness and trying to set up a business in the middle of nowhere, or setting up your business in a town where you've got a diverse range of customers and suppliers and services to plug into. We will greatly lower the barriers for nations and private companies to be operating profitably in space. And that allows many more nations, besides just the US and China, to enter into this economy, to really, and to many smaller companies to trade and engage in business directly with each other without being just dependent on a NASA program or the Chinese or any other government entity. We're really accelerating the timeline from being dependent on government agencies for funding everything in lunar infrastructure to creating a real cislunar economy that operates and looks a lot like an economy on Earth. We've got lots of customers and suppliers interacting.
That was really insightful. And another question made me think of this came up during our law panel in terms of boundaries and what the LDC would actually own or maintain. So in terms of the infrastructure, like a port and then a road, but then if a company builds a lab off of that road, is that governed under the same entity?
Yeah, so the way in which we'd approach the LDC is that the only parties allowed to use infrastructure that is provided by the LDC or funded by the LDC would be members of the LDC. And a member is those parties that have bound themselves to the rules of the LDC. And so, there might be, if there were a company or somebody, some entity that for whatever reason did not want to become an LDC member, maybe they want to use really environmentally destructive techniques for mining resources or use really abusive labor practices, and so don't want to comply with LDC infrastructure. Well, there's nothing the LDC can legally do to stop them, but what it can do is say that you can't use our infrastructure, and that would mean that they would need to build all of what they need themselves, which would be probably very difficult for them to do.
Well, that's another question I know has come up in previous conversations, but the question of bad actors, or someone who wants to, I'm just going to appropriate this and I'm going to land here and drive off. So how does the LDC approach the concept of bad actors and the number of different ways that they could look to game the system or take advantage of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the most direct way is by the way in which we cluster our infrastructure. So if, like earlier I was talking about, we're kind of building service hubs or spaceports that offer all these services, it's unlikely that non-members will want to locate near it because they won't be able to use any of that infrastructure, which means they'd have to build all of their own. And if they're going to do that, they're much more likely to go off somewhere else, more remote, where they're not going to be in constant conflict with LDC infrastructure. And they could probably develop their own customer base out there much more easily. And so a bad actor might try to seize control of the LDC service hub by force, but that also is probably unlikely because the LDC would have some means of defending itself and its members, and also it will have so many nations as investors that it would make it provoke major international backlash because you'd have lots of countries that have made equity investments in these assets that you're seizing. So most non-members will hopefully realize that it will actually be more profitable for them to just become members and plug into all of this than to build it all themselves. But even if for whatever reason they really want to not become members, they'll probably operate further away where the risk of interference with LDC members is less likely and less severe. But there is another, in addition to that direct means of clustering infrastructure, LDC can also be dealing with this problem by supporting in influencing the development of international norms around things like non-interference and acceptable, responsible use of space. And then in this way, it really serves as a great vehicle for advancing some of the principles that we've established under international law for space. Because the LDC can actually be figuring out what are the rules around non-interference in a really specific way, and what's acceptable to do and not to. There's a lot of areas of law that have been developed exactly like this, that weren't developed by a legislature first, but by users of. So this is the way commercial law developed. It was by merchants forming their own informal rules. Maritime law developed like this. Mining law in the American West was developed informally by the early miners that went out there and figured out the rules for themselves. And then those rules.
This was kind of the market creating its own norms, and then the legislature then codified those norms after they had kind of already been in existence. Not the legislature saying this is the new norm, and then the market, responded to that.
That's right. And so that's what I was getting at, is like the LDC basically serves as the body for developing those norms and coordinating their development. And then those can become gradually customary international law. eventually become more and more formalized, so that we can develop, real law to prevent bad actors.
Excellent. Thanks for addressing that. And then I think the question now kind of turns to partners. So who, both in terms of companies and governments or other entities, at this stage, as you go from, where you are now to, when it would be operational, who are you looking to partner with?
Yeah. So at first, we're approaching the space companies that would become members of the LDC, and really bringing them into the project and collaborating with them to help develop, some of the initial rules and infrastructure solutions, and to kind of build out this framework with them so that we can deliver maximum value to them, and as well as working with partner nations, both on the kind of governance development side and working with space agencies to align with their priorities, and with international organizations like UNUSA. So those are the types of partners that we're primarily working with as we build out kind of our team and our funding base for the project.
I know that we had a question that was submitted ahead of time from the audience, just kind of generally about, timeline and metrics. I know that they're not exactly the same. They're kind of two different shades of the same question, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts. You obviously don't have to give us, specific dates about when you're going to be on the moon, but just what does the path, and then what are those benchmarks, I guess, in terms of metrics?
Yeah, so a lot of like the how quickly we get to the moon and are building stuff there depends a lot on circumstances outside the LDC's control, though the LDC could accelerate this quite a bit. So some of it depends on what NASA, what the US government decides, and what China ends up doing, and whether that sparks a race or continues a race to the moon and so forth. However, one of the advantages to the structure we're creating is it's more driven by in a commercial way than a typical government space agency would, or certainly an international body, because rather than being subject to the political pressures and what a legislature is willing to fund a space agency, we can move much more quickly, because we're responding to investors. Investors are putting their money into it in order for us to deliver services and infrastructure on the moon, and we can do it much more efficiently than say NASA probably could, and much more focused on the specific goal of enabling the sustainable development of the lunar economy, society, and environment, rather than having kind of our priorities sort of or attention more distracted or spread out on other priorities besides that. So we should be able to develop what we do at much more efficiently, much faster, at much lower cost than whatever a government would ordinarily do it. And that should accelerate the timeline. And it should accelerate the timeline for everybody else to go to the moon, because we'll be enabling developing countries and countries with small and fledgling space programs to actually, make it much cheaper, easier, and safer for them to operate on the moon using LDC infrastructure.
I think that's I think hugely understated market for this type of venture, because the number of countries that can successfully launch, an advanced crewed lunar exploration program, right now currently is 0. And in the next 10 years might hypothetically get up to 2.
Yeah.
And if so, that's probably where it will stay for the next, couple of decades after that. But the number of countries who have available capital that would be very interested in participating in this environment who can't is probably in the dozens, if not hundreds.
Yeah, that's right. And it's yeah, and it's not just there's companies that can make investments in the LDC to get it off the ground, but ultimately, the LDC is providing its services to anybody who becomes a member. So it enables country government space programs, as well as smaller private companies, but space agencies that agree to the standards and norms that the LDC will be adopting to get into space much easier, because now they'll have lots of Earth-based services, cislunar services, and lunar surface services that they can tap into when they to make that journey there.
I think there's a lot of really exciting potential in that avenue. So, and I wanted to touch base again, going back to the beginning, the lessons of history. We've talked about the LDC and kind of the world that it would seek to foster, the market that it would look to create there on the moon. What, in your mind, are the key lessons of history that we should be remembering as we go, whether for good or for bad?
Yeah, well, I kind of brought up an earlier example of the company states already, and those essentially emerged because European nations wanted to establish dominance in a domain that was new for them in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and were, in the British case, competing with the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch, and they realized that the crown couldn't finance this, and actually the Spanish and Portuguese, which were mainly funded by the crown, were constantly unable to operate profitably, especially after competition entered that marketplace. And so, like, the Portuguese kept having to constantly, the crown kept having to bail out the Estado da India that they were financing, and then they would go bankrupt again and bail them out with more money, and it'd be in this kind of debt spiral. But companies like the East India Company were able to operate profitable businesses because they used private capital and were given a monopoly over trade. Now, that's not to say that the East India Company was good. In fact, the example here is that this is like a major risk that could be used because the circumstances are very similar to what they were in the 1600s. As we look to space, nations competing for dominance, enormous costs that have to be overcome in some way, and there's an attitude of, like, the first companies or nations to secure the resources in space will have enormous control over writing the rules for space in the future. But I do want to point out one interesting historical thing. The Hanseatic League in medieval Europe was a collection of cities that emerged, along the North Sea and Baltic Sea by merchants that were having a very difficult time trading across borders, because in the Holy Roman Empire, which is sort of the dominant, like the nominal power, they still had lots of little kingdoms and duchies and stuff, and each one had imposed little tariffs and taxes and gave monopoly privileges to their own favorite industries. And these merchants ended up banding together to create their own set of rules and their own society, ultimately, in order to allow for free trade and to not have monopolies dominate everything along the most important trading routes in Europe. And they had about 300 years of relative enormous prosperity in the area because they did this. These are all rules that were kind of developed from the bottom up by merchants themselves. And then one other positive historical example comes from, as the era of company states were declining in the late 1700s and early 1800s, we started to see more free ports pop up, which were areas that explicitly eschewed the kind of monopoly privileges and tariffs and allowed anybody to come in and compete, and allowed for people from any nation to live near each other, any race to live near each other, and to cooperate. And there are some areas like Zanzibar off the coast of Africa were like this, but more well-known examples is Hong Kong and Singapore, which both emerged in the 1800s as free ports that operated under a rule of law, with courts, with property rights protected and contracts enforced, and an absence of tariffs, so they had free trade, and allowed for a great deal of social mixing and a free market economy, and as a result, they become enormously prosperous, and today are some of the wealthiest places on earth, and made, unlike the company states, made strong investments in public goods, in infrastructure, in healthcare, and education, in order to give kind of a backbone to the economy, especially places like Singapore are an example of that. And this is the type of thing that we're trying to learn from and build with the LDC, is to create an entity that has the ability and the incentive to make these important investments, contributions to supporting overall economic, social, and environmental health, and using some of these more positive examples from history.
That's fantastic. And that actually kind of did get into my next question here, but how the LDC fits into the broader evolution of space law. And a lot of people think, like, right now, an international treaty is never going to happen, because I think anyone would agree that international relations is not in a harmonious period now, but not even just the troubles of the day, but historically, the arc of space law and how it's evolved. We haven't had a new major treaty in 60, almost 70 years at this point. So how does the LDC fit into that kind of evolving tapestry of space law?
Yeah, and like I mentioned before, the even at best, even when we're in a time of great international harmony, relatively speaking, we produce treaties that assert good but very vague and high-level principles, and oftentimes they are not legally binding. And if somebody violates them, in many cases, there's not much else you can do except kind of shout at them at the United Nations General Assembly or something. And it's really up to individual nations, to adopt domestic laws that try to sort of codify or give effect to some of these international principles. But with the LDC, we can operate in this space of developing a legal framework in the absence of a state, or the absence of sovereignty, through this sort of voluntary membership association that people join in order to access valuable infrastructure. And I think the role that the LDC can play is by guiding and pushing and impelling the development of international norms and standards and laws, a lot like the previous examples that I gave. And so by doing this, you can imagine, like the LDC's rules end up becoming kind of customary international law, because nations begin to identify, like, yeah, that's the right way of preventing dust mitigation, that's an acceptable practice for utilizing resources, and this isn't, and that's so that they can look to what the LDC has figured out as the best solution for those things, and gradually adopt them into the domestic law and to international law.
Interesting. And then we talk about these evolving legal norms, these evolving ideas. New York is a pioneer in a lot of different fields. We're a leader in a lot of different areas, both in space and out of space. And one of the areas that New York does lead is law. So how can the New York legal community participate in some of these conversations, with the LDC and more generally about, these important challenges coming down the pipeline in space law?
Yeah. Well, we need experts in a variety of domains, including law, to help work out a lot of the details of this. Right now, we have kind of a framework for how this can work, but there's quite a bit we want to develop in collaboration with experts. We're planning to develop a simulation of the lunar economy where we can plug in different regulatory frameworks and see what works and what doesn't. And these are all areas that we'd love to collaborate on. And obviously, New York law sometimes is often a choice of law and choice of forum in international contracts. And the LDC will be relying on quite a bit on international agreements, both its members' contracts with members and investor state contracts. And, when those kinds of contracts are negotiated right now on Earth, it's often New York is the law that's selected to resolve disputes. And we might see a similar thing that we do with the LDC.
That's really interesting. That's definitely a thought that we'll follow up on. So we are heading towards the end of our time together. Tell people where they can find you. I know I've put it in the chat, the link to your website, how people can stay in touch for updates. And then if partners or any other interested organizations, either on the call or who see it in the future, how can they find you to get involved?
Yeah, well, like you just put in the chat, you can, our website is www.lunardevelopmentcooperative.com. We haven't developed it out very much yet because we're still very much in kind of early phase, but you can find our white paper on there. White paper is a great way to get introduced to this concept. So I invite you to download it off our website. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me, michael@ldc.space. My email address.
Excellent. I didn't know if anyone who's on the call had a question. I just wanted to thank you for taking the time a number of different times this week to share your expertise and your background. Tell us more about the Lunar Development Cooperative, how it poses some really innovative answers to some of these questions that are coming down space law. I think oftentimes the space industry, when it comes to these legal and governance frameworks, will focus on the challenges rather than the solutions, because the challenges are really obvious, but also seemingly really difficult to resolve. So this is a really interesting conversation, and I'm really glad that we were able to add it into the mix this week.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. So yeah, seeing no further questions, again, thank you to Michael Castle-Miller with the Lunar Development Cooperative for coming today, for sharing us some of these insights about the cooperative, what it would be doing for a future space economy, how we can tackle some of these challenges that we can see coming down the pipeline based on historical examples from international law. So I'll give the final word to Michael, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, well, this is a project that involves people from all different domains, all different parts of the world. And I think it's one of the most important things that's happening in space. And I really believe that this will have a significant impact on countless numbers of people for the next several hundred years. And so it's a great opportunity for, if this resonates with you, and if it's something that you have the means and the interest in being part of, reach out to me. I'd love to work with you. And it's a cause that I'm devoting my life to, and I think it's well worth the efforts that you contribute. So if you've got particular skills or opportunities or something that you want to take part in, we could use it.
Awesome. Thank you again for taking the time. Thank you for everyone who joined us. Be well and have a great day.